Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us this morning. As a lot of you probably know, the economy, by many measures, is doing fairly well. Unemployment is at 3.5%, which is, a record low within the past 50 years or so. But there are a lot of folks who haven't quite benefited from the full extent of the recovery. And one of those main issues is income inequality and the gap in wealth. And I'm really looking forward to talking about this today. So I guess just to get us started, Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit more about, the differences between income inequality versus the differences between the gap in wealth between white and black families and families of color. And Danyelle, if you want to talk after that about some of the driving forces behind that and how that's been created, I think that's a great way to start off our conversation.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality, but both are extremely high in the United States when you compare it to other rich democracies. So estimates differ, but somewhere around 20% of income goes to the richest 1% of income earners in the United States. And for wealth, it's about 40%. And both of those numbers have increased over the last 40 years or so. So in 1980, roughly 10% of income was going to the richest 1%. And income inequality is really the main driver of wealth inequality, because the easiest way to get wealthy is to save the extra income you have, invest it in the stock market, invest it in housing and real estate, invest it in hedge funds, and accumulate wealth accordingly as those assets rise in value. And as we'll get into, one of the striking things about wealth inequality is the extreme racial gap. So the average white household has $140,000 in wealth and net worth, whereas the average African-American household has only a few $1,000s in net worth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, wealth is what allows people to move through life seamlessly. It allows you to pay for a house, put your kids through college, respond to that unintended emergency, whereas income, we're really talking about wages, how much individuals make. For, as you said, for white families, it's about 10 to 1. So for every $10 a typical white family has, a black family only has $1. This is not the result of just having low wages. This actually is a result of systematic harms that have occurred in America towards people of color for over 400 years. A lot of the work that my team does at the Center for American Progress has focused on the racial wealth gap, because we actually believe that the wealth gap is the present day result of collective compounding harms that people of color have faced. So I can talk a little bit about some of those drivers. There are huge drivers around income inequality because of wages. People don't have enough money to save, not only for down payments for housing, but also retirement and other assets, playing in the stock market, for example. But it's also about inheritance. What have people of color's families passed down to them through generations? People of color don't get a lot of inheritance compared to white families, and we know inheritance is a huge driver in building wealth in America.
Now, I want to jump off a point you made about that, because the saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats. But as you mentioned, there have been these obstacles that have built up over years and years for people of color in the United States, and folks that have not let them enjoy the full benefits of what we've seen over the past 10, 11, 12 years. Can you tell me a little bit more about those barriers and those specific instances?
Yeah, part of the reason we have this wealth gap, again, is not about individual choices people have made or families have made. It's really the result of intentional public policies that were implemented over time. So when we talk about universal policies like the GI Bill, for example, that's a great bill that was targeted towards veterans returning home. But what we found is that it actually was targeting white male veterans. Many black veterans didn't have access to those benefits. Those were benefits that allowed white veterans to go to school, buy a home, and really provide seed capital to them and future generations. We see public policies around even building highways. Highways were built that broke predominantly African-American, middle-class neighborhoods apart in order to help white families move in and out of urban centers where there were jobs. There have been multiple government interventions over time that have really made it harder for black families and Latino families to build wealth in America.
And drawing on that, if you look at the housing market specifically, you can really see how those historic mechanisms carry over into the present day to contribute in a very important way to the racial wealth gap. So in the 1920s, there were explicit policies that zoned certain segments of cities only for African American people and only for white people. So in Louisville, for example, this led to a Supreme Court case that eventually struck down these kinds of laws, but then the other mechanisms were put in place to make sure that the races live separately. So there were covenants that were put on mortgages and deed restrictions that made it so a white homeowner could not sell a home to a black person, even if he or she wanted to. And that was in place until the 1950s when the Supreme Court struck that down. But then we still have zoning laws that discriminate against low-income and middle-income homeowners because they block apartment buildings and they block townhouses and attached single-family homes from being built in rich neighborhoods all around the country. Those emerged in the 1920s during a period of rather intense racial discrimination and have continued to this day. And every city in the country has zoning laws, and the suburbs the rich suburbs tend to have exclusionary zoning laws. And so this all contributes to the rather extreme segregation that we have in the United States. And that in turn affects the valuation of assets in black neighborhoods. A recent study that I did with Andre Perry and David Harshberger of the Brookings Institution found that majority black neighborhoods lose $156 billion in wealth each year just through the housing market from the devaluation of homes in those neighborhoods. So the way we did that is the studies, we found that if you compare homes that have the same size and other physical characteristics in a black neighborhood and even have similar schools in terms of test scores to the same home that looks exactly the same but is in a white neighborhood, there's a 23% penalty for the homes in black neighborhoods.
And we know housing, even though it is like a risky asset, it's the best asset in America for building wealth. And to your point, what we also know on the front side of housing is for black families to get a down payment, to get a loan, they are having to work harder and longer to save up the money for a down payment. And they typically receive higher interest rates in taking out the loan. So they are hit at the front end and at the back end when they're trying to sell. So again, this is this compounding impact of harm. It's like a vicious cycle of inequality for families of color.
Now, with that in mind, and both of you mentioned the importance of housing and driving, or narrowing rather, the racial wealth gap. And we're also concurrently dealing in our country with a pretty stark issue in terms of housing affordability. Homelessness rates have risen in major cities across the country. We're seeing rents skyrocket, on a personal level, just looking around the rents in my neighborhood, I'm just kind of blown away by how much it's gone up in just like the past 3 or 4 years. So how much of, I guess the question I'm wondering, how much of solving the racial wealth gap could be done by trying to take out some of these issues in terms of, housing affordability, access to affordable housing in different areas of the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk about some of the public policies are like do no harm policies, right? So like we need to protect Social Security, healthcare, all the things that are important to Americans' everyday lives. We also have to talk about like jobs and wages and what is a good job. It's not just about your actual income, it's also about the benefits you receive. So yes, affordable housing, increasing wages, but also benefits. Are we ensuring that workers have the ability to save money and put it into a 401k? Are we incentivizing employees to not only put in retirement accounts, but play in the stock market? How are we actually creating a quality of life benefits for our workers today so they can not only save for housing, but also for retirement and wealth building?
So some of the solutions that come to mind for me in thinking about the wealth gap, particularly through this lens of housing, is one is to invest in black communities. And in a follow-up research we're going to be publishing shortly, we're finding that businesses in black neighborhoods, even when they have high reviews from Yelp, are getting lower revenue growth compared to even businesses that have low reviews on Yelp but are in white neighborhoods. And so, talking to business owners in black communities, some of the factors that would be helpful would be things like investing in lighting and making reinvesting in the roads and the sidewalks, making the place more accessible through public transportation, maybe making parking available. And historically, we know that Black communities have received less public spending than their fair share. And so rectifying that, I think, could go a long way. But then the other overarching problem dealing with housing affordability is just the crazy zoning laws that we have throughout the country that it's a difficult challenge to tackle. We won't get into it here, but in my view, there was a lot of constitutional debate in the 1920s about whether these kinds of restrictions were even could be deemed constitutional. Essentially, what the Supreme Court decided is that apartments are negative externalities akin to pollution, and essentially poor people are almost should be thought of as negative externalities that are harmful to the healthy well-being of a community. And so I think that view is probably grounded in the racist ideologies that were prevalent in the 1920s and unfortunately have persisted. So doing away with those sort of harmful zoning laws would go a long way to making housing more affordable.
I would also just add on the investment in communities of color and Black communities in particular, it's important to have some not barriers there, but protective barriers there to block against gentrification. What we don't want to see is more and more investment in these communities where the people that are living in these communities and have lived in these communities are pushed out, and it's not affordable to them. I also would argue that we need to get comfortable with having government be as intentional and targeted as they were in the past and infusing the help that these communities need. Again, we are not in this moment where we have rampant inequality, especially this racial wealth gap, because of individual harms. These were intentional choices that our policymakers made, and we need to see that same intentionality in them fixing this harm.
Gotcha. Now, Jonathan, you've written a book recently about kind of tackling, how to make this country a little bit more equal in terms of equality of income, equality of wealth. Can you talk a little bit about what you've explored in your book and the kind of proposals that you've made?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so the book's called Republic of Equals. It's published by Princeton University Press, came out at the end of last year. And I talk a lot about the racial issues that we've already discussed, but also more broadly about how what I call elite professional groups have benefited disproportionately from income growth over the last 40 years, in large part because they've organized very effectively to limit competition for their high-priced services. So in particular, lawyers and doctors and their associations, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, have been very effective at creating restrictions that increase the incomes of their members. And so some specific ones relate, in the medical community, it's against the law to employ a doctor under many circumstances. I can't, if I have an MBA, I can't open a business that employs doctors. The same is true with lawyers, by the way, and offer medical services or legal services. Another important factor is that qualified people who are not doctors but have the appropriate training to provide medical services, like nurse practitioners, are not allowed to practice independently of doctors in most large states in the country. And likewise, dental hygienists are not allowed to practice independently of dentists. And when you look at, and paralegals are not allowed to practice and provide legal services that they're capable of providing without a oversight from a lawyer. And so when you look at how those play out in the economy, what you see is that 15% of people in the top 1% are doctors, 7% are lawyers. And if you compare that to other groups that we think about as sort of iconic top 1% rich people, CEOs are only 11%. So we have more doctors in the top 1% than we have CEOs. And I think that's pretty striking for a lot of people, and especially when you think about all the rules and regulations that go into boosting the incomes of doctors, and the fact that we're spending 18% of GDP on healthcare compared to 9% in just about every other OECD country.
It's really interesting. And Danyelle, just to wrap everything up, what are some of the solutions that you've been thinking about and working on at CAP and, laying the groundwork for the next, few years of trying to right the system and rectify these issues?
Yeah, over the past 3 years, we've really been looking deeply at the racial wealth gap, and we believe that it is something that not only we as think tank policy thinkers should be thinking about, we think that our legislators should really take this issue seriously and figure out a way of what policies, practices, regulations, executive orders can be taken to make a real dent in this gap. We have recently stood up a national advisory council to look at the racial wealth gap, and we have charged this council with building out what those executive orders are. What are the regulations that need to change? What are the new big public policy ideas that we have, whether it's baby bonds or infusing capital into these neighborhoods and really digging into those details.
Well, Jonathan, Danielle, we had a fantastic conversation this morning. It could go on for hours, but unfortunately, that's the time that we have. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you.
Thank you.